In urban combat, there is a rule every soldier learns on their very first day. The streets belong to the dead. If you step off the curb, if you leave the cover of concrete and steel, you have roughly 3 seconds before a sniper ends your life. Every instinct, every hour of training tells you to stay hidden, to shoot first, to survive. But before I continue, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. You won't believe how this story unfolds. But what happens when surviving requires you to do the exact opposite? What happens when an enemy soldier walks directly into the crosshairs of 30 rifles and drops his weapon? To understand the gravity of what happened that day, you have to understand the battlefield. Sector 4 wasn't always a graveyard of shattered concrete. Just 6 months earlier, this was a thriving commercial district. It was a place of corner bakeries, heavy traffic, and apartment balconies filled with hanging laundry. Now, under the harsh, bright sun, it was a meat grinder. The blinding daylight offered no places to hide, only sharp contrasts of ruined buildings and blinding white dust. Sergeant Alexei Morozov wiped a thick layer of grit from his tactical goggles. He was 28, but the last 4 weeks of block-to-block fighting had aged him a decade. His squad of 12 men was exhausted. They were operating on 3 hours of sleep, rationing their water, and counting every single magazine of ammunition. They were tasked with holding a rusted-out delivery truck at the intersection of what used to be Elm and 4th Street. Across the avenue, no more than 50 yards away, enemy fighters had dug into a row of collapsed bank buildings in an open field. 50 yards is a sprint. In a ruined city, 50 yards is an ocean. Every single window across the street was a potential sniper hide. Every pile of rubble could be masking a heavy machine gun. Alexei's radio crackled to life. Command ordered him to hold the intersection at all costs, but they were sitting ducks. The waiting ended at exactly 1400 hours. It started with a single shot that shattered the side mirror of the delivery truck, showering Alexei's squad in glass. Then the world erupted. The air instantly filled with the suffocating smell of cordite and pulverized brick. It was deafening. The sound of high-caliber rounds hitting the truck sounded like a sledgehammer striking a church bell. Alexei leaned out, raising his rifle, firing controlled bursts toward the second floor of the bank. To his left, his youngest soldier, a 19-year-old named Vance, was pressing himself so hard into the asphalt he looked like he was trying to merge with it for 15 relentless minutes. The street was a hurricane of flying debris and lead. Neither side could advance. Neither side could retreat. If a man stood up, he would be cut in half. They were trapped in a brutal, uncompromising stalemate. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The barrels of their rifles were burning hot to the touch. It was the kind of fight where no one wins, where two sides simply grind each other down into the pavement. And then the shooting abruptly stopped. It didn't fade away. It didn't taper off. It just stopped. Alexei kept his rifle trained on the bank, his breathing heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the settling dust, he saw movement. An enemy soldier was standing up. At first, Alexei thought the man had simply lost his mind. Combat fatigue does terrible things to the human brain. Sometimes men just snap. But this man wasn't panicked. He stepped out from behind a jagged concrete wall and walked directly into the center of the open street. The bright afternoon sun beat down on him. There was no cover, no protection. He was entirely exposed. Instantly, the men behind the truck shifted. Alexei felt his finger tighten on the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure away from ending the man's life. Down the line, the sniper of the squad leveled his sights directly at the center of the enemy's chest. 30 rifles on both sides of the street were trained on this single man. But the enemy soldier didn't raise his weapon. He didn't charge. He stopped in the dead center of the avenue. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung his rifle from his shoulder. He held it out to the side, and he dropped it. The metal clattered loudly against the pavement. The sound echoed down the ruined street. Nobody fired. Nobody breathed. The man raised both hands high in the air. He began shouting. The words were in a different language, frantic, echoing off the concrete. Alexei couldn't understand a single syllable. The soldier pointed violently toward a half-collapsed, 3-story building positioned directly behind Alexei's squad. He shouted again, his voice cracking with pure desperation. The men around Alexei tightened their grips. Someone muttered that it was a distraction, a trick to get them to turn their backs so the enemy could rush the truck. But Alexei studied the man's face. He wasn't looking at the 30 rifles aimed at his head. He was staring wide-eyed at the building behind them. He wasn't stepping forward to surrender. He was subtly stepping backward, as if his body was rejecting the idea of being anywhere near that structure. The enemy soldier shouted one last time. When no one moved, he did something completely unexpected. He dropped his hands, took 2 sudden steps forward, and crouched. Every rifle bolted upright. The sniper took up the slack on his trigger. But the man just picked up a heavy piece of broken concrete from the street. He stood up, locked eyes with Alexei, and hurled the rock directly at the doorway of the ruined building. The rock bounced off the doorframe and rolled into the shadows of the first floor. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then the dust shifted. Caught in a shaft of sunlight, a thin, taut wire became visible. It was stretched tight across the base of the entrance, leading deep into the darkness of the structure. Alexei's blood ran, completely cold. He didn't need to speak the man's language. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Alexei screamed at his men to stop, shoving them back, physically pulling Vance away from the proximity of the building. He called up his combat engineer. The engineer crawled forward, keeping low, tracing the line of the wire with a small optic. When the engineer returned, his face was pale, entirely drained of color. He looked at Alexei and shook his head. It wasn't just a doorway trap. The wire ran into the basement. The entire foundation of the building was rigged with heavy explosives. It was a massive charge, an indiscriminate trap set long before either squad had arrived. Alexei turned slowly and looked back into the street. The enemy soldier was still standing there, arms raised, completely defenseless. If that bomb had detonated during the firefight, the blast radius would have collapsed the street. It would have vaporized Alexei's men. It would have crushed the bank across the street. It would have wiped out both units in a fraction of a second. Someone had intended to turn this entire intersection into a mass grave. Alexei stepped out from behind the truck. He lowered his rifle. He didn't put it away, but he pointed the barrel at the ground. He looked at the man in the street, then pointed at the rigged building. He nodded. The enemy soldier let out a breath. He looked like he had been holding for an eternity. He slowly lowered his hands. He looked around at the destroyed shops, the shattered apartments, the pulverized remains of his city. He didn't want this block turned to ash. He didn't want to die. And he didn't want the men across the street to die for absolutely nothing. For a long minute, the two sides simply watched each other. Enemies, locked in a brutal war, suddenly connected by a profound act of mutual survival. One by one, the soldiers behind the delivery truck lowered their weapons. Across the street, the rifles protruding from the bank windows slowly pulled back into the shadows. The man in the street took one last look at Alexei. He didn't salute. He didn't smile. He just turned, picked up his rifle from the dust, and slowly walked back toward his own lines. The squad's engineer spent the next 20 minutes carefully dismantling the firing mechanism of the foundation bomb. For 20 minutes, both sides were entirely exposed. For 20 minutes, either side could have easily opened fire and wiped the other out. Not a single shot was fired when the charge was finally rendered safe. Alexia looked across the avenue. The bank was empty. The enemy fighters had quietly fallen back, disappearing deep into the ruins of the city. The firefight was over. Not because reinforcements arrived, not because one side achieved tactical superiority. It ended because one man looked at the madness around him, stepped into the crosshairs, and made a choice. War is full of enemies. History books are filled with the names of men who pulled the trigger. But sometimes, the most profound act of courage on a battlefield isn't fighting. It's having the power to end a life and choosing not to. One soldier stepped into the open, unarmed, surrounded by death, and he saved dozens of lives. If you enjoy powerful, realistic war stories like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. In the heat of that moment, with your squad pinned down, would you have trusted the man in the street, or would you have pulled the trigger? Because out there, the difference between a hero and a casualty is often just a single decision.